you hear me?
Yep.
Do you see a countdown?
I think we're live.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second of 3 episodes of the Fisher Avalanche Safety Tips series. My name's Mike Hattrup. I'm the U.S. Product Manager and Content Director at Fisher, and I'm also an AMGA ski mountaineering guide. And with me is Sarah Carpenter. She is also an AMGA ski mountaineering guide and co-owner of the American Avalanche Institute, which is the oldest uh, educational organization in the U.S. And they teach courses in Montana, Wyoming, and Utah, and also online. So, good place to check out. So, last week we talked a little bit about the Avalanche Report, understanding how to read it, and we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into that this week. We will look at some of the different avalanche problems, such as deep slab, storm slab, wind slab, and also look at stability, some stability tests, or as some people would call them, instability tests, and we'll discuss that a little bit too. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about some different rescue techniques. So, with that, let's get started. Sarah, when you think about the Avalanche Report, usually you have the report will outline one or maybe multiple problems, right? And the thing that I think is really cool about the new reports is before it gave you an avalanche warning, an alert, which was low, moderate, considerable, high, or extreme, and that's what you got. And then you had to go out and figure out what kind of problem it was. Now it's super helpful because it will say the primary problem out there that we're concerned about is wind slab, and we have a secondary problem of maybe deep instability, and both of those have different repercussions because um, a wind slab you can isolate that into specific zones in your forecast area, right? So we're looking at ridge tops or maybe cross loading uh, on some perpendicular ridge lines, and whereas deep instability could be across the whole zone. Maybe it's only on the northern aspect. So, Sarah, can you talk a little bit about some of the different? Let's talk. Let's do this. Which one concerns you the most? Is there an avalanche problem that concerns you more than the others?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Mike, we yes, last time we talked about sort of the general avalanche report and the hazard rating and how that's a conversation with risk. And I agree with you of like the coolest evolution that we've had with the forecast centers is talking about these avalanche problems now, because it really refines how you choose to manage terrain and where you're going. The problems that scare me the most are persistent slab avalanche problems and deep persistent slab problems. And I'm assuming it's probably the same for you because these two problems are really hard to forecast for. So when we talk about persistent slab and deep persistent slab, what we're talking about is we've got a big slab or some cohesive unit of snow, and it's sitting on a weak layer that was formed, who knows, a couple weeks ago, a month ago. And the reason it's called a persistent slab is it's sitting on a persistent weak layer, meaning the weak layer sticks around a long time. So sugary, weak, faceted snow, or surface hoar, which on the surface is these beautiful sparkly crystals, but when it gets buried, it sticks around for a long time. And with both of these, oftentimes the slab that it's sitting on tends to be a little harder or firmer, so it can support your weight and you can get partway out onto a slope before it avalanches. And so oftentimes these problems break above you, and they also tend to just have more snow on top of them. And so they tend to be bigger avalanches, which are harder to survive. So with these, it's not clear. Like you can get away with things for a while and then you might hit the wrong spot and have catastrophic failure. So
right. So what are some typical? I know one of the problems. I'm in Colorado right now, driving home, and one of the problems that Colorado sees is they have these persistent weak layers and deep persistent weak layers. And let's talk a little bit about where you might find those. One of those is in Colorado. It's that buried surface, or not buried surface ore, but buried facets that you'll often find at the ground level, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like if you get early season snow, the October snow that shuts down your amazing mountain biking, and then it doesn't snow for another month or month and a half, basically all that snow that fell on the ground is just rotting. And on sunny aspects, it melts or it turns to a crust, but on those shady aspects, it basically turns to sugar. And so then when you try and build a winter snowpack on top of that, it's like putting a house on a foundation of sand. So you just don't have a lot of support.
Right, right. So, and that tends to be one of the bigger problems we see in Colorado, whereas maybe in the Northwest, they rarely see that because the snow they get, it's warmer for starters, and the warm weather helps uh, compact and solidify the snowpack.
Yep.
With those cool temps that create that temperature gradient that develops those facets on the ground. So,
Yep.
so ground facets, that's one of the issues. Some of the others are those the surface hoar that you mentioned, and maybe you get it above and below some crust layers as well, right?
Yeah, you can see faceting above and below crust layers, or sometimes you'll have, right now in Tetons, we've got surface hoar forming on top of a crust, which makes it even trickier because with surface hoar, the way it strengthens, it's like it's these little umbrellas, basically they form on top. They're drawn as a V if you're documenting. But the way that they strengthen is the surface hoar penetrates the snow above it and also below it. So it basically squishes out. And so if you have surface hoar on top of a crust, it takes a lot longer to strengthen because it just doesn't squish out on that bottom layer. So,
and these persistent weak layers, sometimes they'll last all season, right?
yeah. Yeah. And sometimes sometimes they're problematic early season because you get a little bit of snow on top of those ground facets. And then you get more snow and maybe it's harder to hit that weak layer, but you can in thin spots. And then at the end of the season, when you start melting the snowpack, you can reawaken those facets as well, just putting a bunch of water on them. So yeah, they can be problematic all season.
Okay, so if you have this problem in the Avalanche report that's either a primary, secondary problem of deep, persistent weak layers, what are there any tests that are particularly useful for identifying this? And if let's start there. What tests would you what field test perform?
Yeah. So my field test of choice in general is the extended column test. It basically allows you to create a little mini avalanche on your own, but it's only good for the top meter of the snowpack, so the top 3 feet of the snowpack. And so if your weak layer is much deeper than that, then the one test that's out there is called the propagation saw test. And that's not looking at the strength of the slab above or like how much force it would take to get a weak layer to fail, but it's testing propagation. Basically, you isolate this skinny column of snow upslope and drag a saw through the weak layer. And if you can drag your saw more than halfway up the weak layer, you're less likely to see propagation in the field than if you barely nick the weak layer and that failure propagates all the way up the column. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep. Um, so that's one test you can do, but of course you can't do a single test and say, okay, that looks good. Let's go skiing, right? So
yeah,
it's interesting to talk about. Most people go out, or I shouldn't say most people, but a lot of people go out. They'll dig a pit somewhere, and based on that pit, they'll make a decision whether to ski that slope or not. What's the flaw with this?
the flaw with that is these tests like the snowpack isn't uniform all the way across the slope. And so you might put your snow pit in a really strong spot, but just a couple feet over, it's really weak and there's potential to hit a weak layer. And the hurdle, we had this conversation the other night of these tests are really more instability tests than stability tests. So just because they don't fail in one spot doesn't mean a slope is good to go. But I really pay attention to them if they fail. So when I get unstable results, that's enough for me to change my decision. If I was thinking I might ski something, I get an unstable result, that's plenty for me to back off of a slope. But if I get stable results, that's not enough for me to choose to ski the slope. I also want more information. Like I want to know that there hasn't been any cracking or collapsing or avalanche activity on my approach on similar aspects and similar elevations. I want to know that the avalanche problem that we were worried about isn't present on the slope that I'm going to travel on. So I want more information to choose to ski something than to not choose to ski something.
Right. Okay. And one of the ways I like to look at this is most people have played the game Hangman, where you have a little stick figure and you have maybe seven dashes that each contain a letter. It's like what's the game? The game show?
Oh, Wheel of Fortune.
Wheel of Fortune. Thank you. So my point is, if the stability test is like one letter, and if
Yeah.
you are playing a game of Hangman with a 7-letter word, and you got one letter, say your stability test shows that slope, that snowpack is stable, and so you got one letter in that 7-letter word. Are you ready to gamble all your money and say, boom, I know the word? Most probably not. And I think avalanche forecasting or evaluation is similar in that the stability test or whatever the field test you do is one letter. And you need a whole bunch of letters. You better have 5 or 6 of that word to have any confidence that you know with affirmation that is safe to ski, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. Yeah, the more information, yeah, the better, the more informed your decision is. And I think we've focused so much on digging pits because it's a more complex piece of the puzzle. But those other observations of have I had cracking, have I had collapsing, is the avalanche problem present? Those are so important.
Right. So let's name a few of the other things that we should be looking at. You just added a bunch: collapsing, wumping, um, the signs of other avalanches. Right.
Yeah.
What about weather?
Yeah, it's a good question. The questions I like to ask is the weather contributing to the instability? And so it's, general rule of thumb, and this is a basic rule of thumb, and there's exceptions, but like an inch an hour for 6 hours or more, and you're going to see increased instability, or 12 to 18 inches in the past 24 hours, your avalanche hazard will be elevated. And then, what we were talking about the other night was wind. Like the wind can move 10 times the amount of snow that can fall from the sky. So that can be a really big player of.
So that's an interesting one to look at too, because you have the amount of snow, the rate of snowfall, and so maybe you only have 5 inches of snow, right? But if you have wind, that could add up to 15 inches in one spot
Yeah.
pretty easily, right? So
Yeah.
now all of a sudden you're thinking, well, there's only 5 inches of snow, it's not a big deal. But in some of those places, if you have some wind transport, it could really be the equivalent of 15 plus inches of snow, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which then dramatically changes your stability. So, yeah.
Right. Um, so let's look at some of the other things. So let's look at wind slab. That's something that we see often in the Sun Valley area. Is wind slab is what is often one of the primary concerns.
Yeah.
And that wind slab, unlike persistent weak layer or say storm slab, wind slab is isolated, right? You kind of have an idea of where you're going to find that.
Yeah, you often do. I mean, it's depending on the direction of the wind. You know, if you had southwest winds, you can anticipate that it's probably loading northeast aspects. And it also, wind slab tends to be in more open areas versus those tree zones. And you know, we were talking the other night about terrain can funnel wind. So just because it was a southwest wind and you think everything's going to go to northeast aspects, you know, knowing how your terrain influences the wind is important as well. Sometimes you have pockets on different aspects.
Right. And so
Yeah.
what are signs that you can tell that you can see to know whether there's been wind loading or not, other than looking at the avalanche report?
Yeah, there's a bunch. If you're looking around, you can see cornices, and that gives you an indicator that there's been wind loading. You can also see like wind etching on the snow. Sometimes they call it sastrugi. And the eroded side, so the steep side, is where the wind is coming from. And then the gradual side is where the wind is going to. So that can give you a sense of where that wind has traveled. And then also, if you're walking along and all of a sudden it feels like you're on a hollow core door, that can give you a sense that you are on wind slab. It just sounds hollow and drummy.
And where are you likely to find these places where you have wind loading?
You know, often it's, you know, for us in the Tetons, it's typically, you know, mid to upper elevations, right? And then exposed areas is what I think about. So when I see wind slab on the forecast, I often head for the trees. Because I know it's not going to move around as much snow in the trees.
Okay. Are there any specific field tests that you would do for wind?
I mean, wind slab, I think you brought up a great point of like a lot of it is just observing. And if you're seeing signs of wind loading, then those might be places that you want to avoid. And sometimes it's just a little pocket up high, or sometimes it's a whole slope. But if I'm curious what's going on, you know, with that interface of what the wind slab is sitting on, that's when I'll pull out, you know, the extended column test or the compression test. And the extended column test is sort of like the new school test, although it's not that new anymore. But it's wide. It's 90 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters upslope. And you just tap on one side of it, and you're looking to see if you can make one side of the column fail and then also propagate all the way across the column. So you're basically creating a little mini avalanche. And if I see it propagate, I'm like, okay, red flag.
Okay, so and this is the same as a column test, really, the old school column test, but now it's extended into basically three columns combined, right? So it's 90 centimeters long by 30 deep, right?
Yeah.
What and explain again why is this better than the column test? Because do you do the column test still, or has
Yeah,
it been replaced by the?
I'll still do the column test at sometimes, just to sort of see how things are sticking together. The thing I like about the extended column test is you're not only just looking at the strength of snow, so like how hard do I have to hit it in order for failure to happen? But sometimes you can have failure in a small column test that doesn't go all the way across a big column test. And so I feel like the extended column test takes my gray area from pretty wide, like it can be with the compression test, to a just narrower lane of gray. So I get to look at how strong is my snowpack? Can I initiate a failure, but also can that failure travel all the way across the column? Can I create this little mini avalanche?
Okay. And how long has that test been around?
That's a good question. Ron Simonhoist came up with it. I don't know. Well, definitely more than 10 years, but I can't remember how many more than 10 years.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit since we all love skiing powder. Let's talk a little bit about storm slab.
Yeah.
Because storm slab is one of those that, again, that's probably I think the signs you're looking for is back to your comment on precipitation. How much has it snowed? How long has it been snowing? What's the rate per hour? And how long has that snowpack had time to adjust to the new weight of the snow.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what do you look for with storm slabs?
When I'm out in the field, what I'm going to ask with Storm Slab is, do I have a recipe for an avalanche? And so with the Storm Slab, you need a slab. So sometimes you just get foof, right? I used to ski patrol at Bridger Bowl, and you would get the BBC, the Bridger Bowl cloud, and you get this 4% density snow that you couldn't even make a snowball with it. And if you've got snow like that, you don't have a cohesive unit of snow to move down the hill. And so that's what I'm looking for with Storm Slab is it cohesive? Is it slabby enough that I can create an avalanche?
Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the better tests for that is ski cutting, right? If there's a safe place to ski cut.
If there's a safe place to ski cut, it's an interesting thing of like, I think ski cutting is really useful, but with the backcountry being really busy, you have to be really careful. The last thing you want to do is ski cut a slope and then bring the whole slope down on someone standing below you.
Well, that's a good point, and maybe that's a place we should divert into a little bit. Is backcountry etiquette? Maybe some of the listeners are fairly new to backcountry, but I think we all are aware that there's going to be more people in the backcountry this winter than any winter in the past. And what that brings with it is just backcountry etiquette, and you have to think beyond your party, right? So your point that if you're cutting a slope, you better know what's below it, and not just right below, because who knows how far this will run.
Yeah, we've had a couple close calls here in the Tetons where, someone's ski cut a big slope and, it surprises them. It goes way bigger than they think it will and runs all the way to the valley floor. And fortunately, the couple instances I'm thinking of, people didn't get hit. Although there was an incident maybe last year where one party triggered an avalanche on another party all the way at the base. So I think, ski cutting can be useful, but also thinking about finding really small slopes, like little test slopes, 10, 15, 20 foot tall slopes, and jumping on those are, with the amount of use, a better way to do it right now.
And that's maybe something to keep an eye on your tour up, finding those little slopes, because maybe when you get to the top, you don't have any. And of course, everybody's itching to go ski that 1,000-foot pitch, and so maybe there's not a little one to practice on. But that's a great point. And ski cutting, yeah, it's great for storm slab. Would you ever ski cut something if the problem was a persistent weak layer?
I mean, I would if it's just storm snow sitting on a persistent weak layer, like just a little bit of storm snow sitting on a surface hoar layer. But as soon as it's purely a persistent slab, no, because the hurdle is they're stiffer and you can get further out on them and then have them break above you.
Great.
Less than ideal.
Let's shift towards the spring, one of my favorite times to tour. Snowpack starts to stabilize. You're feeling pretty good often about the avalanche hazard. So the avalanche problem you're looking at then is often wet snow, or either loose wet or wet slab.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about those a little bit, and when you might find those, how widespread they are.
Yeah. With wet snow avalanche problems, it's when the temperature's going above 0 degrees Celsius or above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you're introducing liquid water into your snowpack. And so when I think about wet, loose avalanches in the spring, when we're talking about that, I'm thinking later in the day or steep south-facing slopes that are getting direct sunlight is when you can often see that. So with these wet, loose problems, you almost work around the compass, or you just start really early and you're done with your ski day at 10:30 in the morning. And that can be really useful. So you'll often see people with the spring skiing. I'm going to look at, did it freeze the night before? How long did it freeze? Was it just an hour or was it 5 hours? And how cold was it? Was it 31 or was it 20? And then you get a sense of how long you have to be able to operate out there. When you see wet slabs, it's oftentimes the persistent slab problems from early in the season are now reawakening. And so if I'm seeing wet slab activity again, it's in part a timing thing. So you want it to be really frozen if you're going to travel somewhere. And it might also just be an aspect that you avoid, because often those persistent slab problems are on more shaded slopes. That's a general rule. It's not always, but so if I have a slab problem, I might have it on more northerly slopes. So maybe I'm going to focus my spring skiing on more southerly slopes until that strengthens.
And I guess one of the reasons I like spring touring is this is probably the most predictable avalanche problem out there, right? Because if you get a good freeze for a number of hours and you're on that slope early, you can be pretty confident in it, right? It's not like a persistent slab or even a storm slab where is this going to go, is it not? You're pretty confident until you're getting to that tipping point.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And I've heard of exceptions, but in general, yeah, you're dealing with like, do I have strong snow that's frozen or do I have weak snow that's melted? And so it is an easier time depending on the location, but to forecast. Yeah.
Are there any stability tests that you would do for those types of avalanche problems?
Not really. Unfortunately, the stability tests don't seem to work all that well in wet snow. It's more, paying attention to, are my skis sinking through? How deep are they sinking through? I'll stick my ski pole in and see how thick the crust is, see how well frozen it is. If it's a persistent slab, you might be able to do an extended column test, but in general, it's more avoidance than trying to figure it out.
Yeah. So that brings up a point that a lot of the research you can do, I guess, establishing what the avalanche hazard is has a couple different components. One, it's looking at the avalanche report, right? And then and that's what the experts have come back with, and they say we think it's a moderate hazard, and the primary problem is wind slab, and the secondary problem is persistent, and and so you get your rating based on that, and now your job is to go out there in the field and either prove them right or wrong, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what the challenges are for the forecaster, because the forecaster is giving you the avalanche forecast on a huge area, right? And they may or may not have actually been there recently. What are they relying on to get those forecasts?
I mean, a lot of it is relying on weather data. So, looking at wind data, snow data, temperatures. And then they're also relying on people touring out there and sending back their reports. And so, the more use we have, if people can send back a note saying, hey, I saw an avalanche here, that gives forecasters really good information. But, some forecasters are covering hundreds of miles with just weather stations and getting to places once or twice a month. So, yeah, I think what you're bringing up is important. Of the avalanche forecast is not the word that we all live by. It's the hypothesis that we start our day with, and we go out to prove it or disprove it, because they're not on every single slope that we're going to choose to ski or ride on.
Right. No, and I think that's a good point and a good thing to be aware of, because just because the avalanche report says it's low hazard or it's moderate hazard doesn't mean it will be on that particular slope that you want to ski that day.
Yeah. I think that's where you start asking those questions of, is the avalanche problem that they were telling me present? Have I had any signs of instability? And then what did my instability test tell me? And what's my gut saying, right? You got a bad feeling. You should listen to that as well.
Right. And how often, or are there, what are the other problems that you see quite a lot in your area? Is there anything that we haven't covered that's worthwhile touching on?
No, I mean in our area, and we can even pull up a Jackson forecast. In our area, we see a lot of times this is an old forecast. We pulled up one from last year. And like we were talking about, you see the hazard rating. We get a bunch of current weather data up above that. And then scrolling down, what we'll see are the avalanche problems. We see a lot of wind slab and then often, persistent slab or deep slab. We pretty much never see storm slab in our forecast. Just not how our forecasters put it. So
okay, so there's a couple of things on this report that are worth mentioning. You see a flower there with you've got north, south, west, east aspects, and those are highlighted in different. I can't see it very well on my phone, but talk a little bit about that, Sarah, because this problem isn't everywhere, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is the conversation about risk and the deeper dive that we were talking about. That flower, basically where everything intersects is the peak of the mountain. And this is like a topo map. So everything falls away. So you drop down in elevation and then you've got all the different aspects labeled. And so what the forecasters in this case are saying is they suspect wind slab problems on mid and upper elevations from northwest all the way through south aspects, but not so much on those southwest and west aspects, and likely because that's where our wind comes from. And then if you keep moving across, you see the formula of their likelihood of triggering an avalanche, they say is right in the middle. It's likely. And then the size of it, small or large. So large to me means definitely big enough to vary a person. And then is the trend increasing or decreasing? So is it getting worse during the day, or is it getting not as, is it decreasing or staying the same? So in this case, we must have a decent bit of snow to blow around if they're saying it's going to increase during the day. And so I think that this is the other part of why we all love these problems is the forecasters are drilling down even more of here's really where I think it is. Here's how scared I am of it. And, here's how big the avalanche is that you might trigger.
There's a ton of information packed into this. Can you scroll down, up a little bit back? Yeah, so let's look at this rating. So here again, this is similar to the avalanche flower. It doesn't have aspects, but it has the different below tree line, timberline, the high alpine, and different ratings for each of those.
Yeah. And sometimes they all look the same, but yeah, in this case, you got your upper elevations are considerable and then moderate and low. So that gives you a ton to go on. And if you forget the ratings on this, you just click underneath the mountain and it gives you a full definition of all the hazards or the hazard definitions. So yeah, there's a ton of information in this one page. You just, the more refined you can be with your understanding and not just looking at the hazard, but look at the problems.
And we do a ton of information in terms of planning your tour. If I'm looking at this just on a quick take, okay, it's wind slab is a primary hazard, and like you said, often when you see wind slab as a primary problem, you'll stay in the tree line. And when we look down here at this report, the tree line is low hazard, and it's probably better skiing as well. And if you can stick to southwest slopes on lower elevation, you can probably have a great day out with great skiing and very low avalanche concern.
Yeah, I look at this a lot as like avoidance. If I can avoid the problem and aim for low hazard, those are the best days. There's no need to complicate decisions. And I'm not saying that I never go into bigger terrain or higher elevations, but if I can avoid the problem, that's what I like to do.
Right. So don't let the objective get in your way of good decision making.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about Avalanche technology, rescue technology specifically. And beacons have come a long ways, and beacons are not very old. Skady introduced the first avalanche beacon in 1971. And then we went through a phase of those were all analog beacons until the late 90s when Backcountry Access, or BCA, introduced the first digital beacon, right?
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about the evolution of beacon technology. Why is the digital technology better than the analog?
The nice thing about the digital technology is you have a processor that gives you distance and direction. And when Tracker introduced their beacon, they added an antenna. I think we checked this, right? They had a second antenna right off the bat.
Yep.
So the initial analog transceivers had one antenna and it would give you distance. And so when you got closer, the beep, the tone got louder. And when you got further away, it got quieter. And then you put a second antenna, so you cross the antennas and you got direction. And so now you're able to somewhat triangulate where someone is buried. So you get a distance and you get a direction. And then with that digital piece, you get the processor that tells you, hey, I think you're about 40 meters from them in this direction. And then in the last few years, there's been a third antenna added. And that's a function of, and this is sort of rough, but it's a function of depth. And it's a smaller antenna and it sort of hangs off one of the other ones. And with that, so you have distance, you have direction, and you have depth, which is nice in deeper burials. And just for those fine searches, it allows you to get closer right off the bat. And so we've made searching much quicker. When we learned, we were comparing notes. When we learned on these analog beacons, and you run back and forth across the slope, listen to where the signal faded, come back to a louder signal, go back to where it fades, find the loudest signal, and then basically just walk across it until you finally found someone. So it took a while. And now you like follow the lights and numbers and you're at that buried person much quicker, provided you're actually practicing with your transceiver.
Which is a good point. We'll get to practicing in a second, but so that's great. So you can find your buried partner, your buddy, much quicker now, which leads us to, in general, if trauma isn't the problem, that if there's no trauma involved in the burial, then you essentially have 15 minutes to find and extricate, or at least get them an oxygen channel. Within the first 15 minutes, 92% of the people without traumatic injury are alive, right? So, and after that, it declines sharply. So you've got a short window. And beacons now, the search is less of the proportion of time required to locate and dig that person out. The thing that takes the most time now is shoveling, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it always has. It's just we were able to pay attention to it more because we could just run to the buried transceiver. Yeah, shoveling takes a long time. You're basically moving a bunch of concrete, because when the avalanche debris goes down the hill and it sets up. Yeah. The great place to practice is digging in the plow debris. That'll give you a sense of what real avalanche debris feels like.
Right. Good point. So based on that, your shovel matters and your probe matters. So the plastic shovels may be great for building a booter, but maybe not so good for digging somebody out of an avalanche.
Yeah, agreed. Good metal shovel that's been thoughtfully designed by one of the outdoor gear manufacturers. I have a BCA shovel that it not only shovels in shovel mode, but it also flips around and has a hoe mode, so you can move a lot of snow. I really like that. But yeah, good metal shovel, and then really thoughtful shoveling techniques. There's been a bunch of papers written on this, but not digging if you probe someone and you find them. And you find them because there's a change of depth, and there's also a little bit of give, right? Even if you have abs of steel, you're still going to have a little give to your abs, versus hitting a rock if you probe them.
Right.
When you shovel, you don't shovel straight down into the probe. You're going to step downhill and try and dig in towards the person, so you have a platform, so you can roll them over, you can get to their airway, you can do first aid. And doing that strategically is really important. And, I know BCA has a bunch of videos, and Fisher's gonna drop them into the resource page for folks to check out some of those strategic shoveling videos.
Yeah, and Bruce Edgerly, one of the founders of BCA, was the first person that I'm aware of that really looked at shoveling analytically and said, you know what, we should spend some more time on this. Nobody talks about it. It's arguably the most important thing in terms of time consumption. So, anyways, like Sarah said, there's some great links to videos that BCA has done that are on their website, and we'll provide those links later. And I guess the last thing we should talk about before we should sign off is how often should you take a refresher course? Say you've taken Avalanche 1. I think we've established that if you took it before EC, the extended column test was taught, you should probably retake it.
Yes.
But what else? What's a good time to take either a refresher course or redo the course?
Yeah, I mean, all these skills are perishable, and so if you don't use them, they disappear. You forget them, and so I'm biased. I'll tell you to take a course every year, but I think taking advantage of continuing education is awesome every year. So there's all these Snow and Avalanche workshops locally that you can do. We built out some online refresher courses. We've got a level 1 refresher and a level 2 refresher that are solidly just online. And I honestly think if it's been 2 years or 3 years since you've taken your course, or you've taken time off of your backcountry skiing endeavors, then it's really useful. Or if you're listening going, I have no idea what the extended column test is, then you should definitely do it. Yeah. Yeah. But, I think every 2 or 3 years, because there's nuance too. And we've got researchers doing all sorts of cool research on decision-making theory and snowpack mechanics and all of it. And so we adjust things all the time.
Yeah, I've noticed even the probing, instead of, it was a circular probe now, or previously, and it's switched to more rectangular because it's easier to keep track of. And so there's subtle things, like you said, that are happening all the time that make sense to revisit this. And you brought up another good point in that it also depends on how much you're getting out there. If you get out a couple times a year, you're probably not getting enough feedback from all of this, and it would make more sense to take a refresher course sooner, even if you took one a couple years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's also there's some great learning opportunities. There's 1-day rescue courses that just focus on all those rescue skills. And we've had folks go through those, and they call them a booster shot for their rescue skills. There's these online refreshers. There's more courses. There's, free Snow and Avalanche workshops. There's, I'll do a shameless plug we've got Avalanche Awareness Night in Jackson on Thursday. And I believe attendance is free or maybe a small donation. And those events are awesome. If you can attend something every year, you just get your brain back into snow. And I think that's really helpful. As guides, when you're working for a guide service, I think I attend like 4 guide trainings every fall.
Right.
And, before the snow flies, I'm like, okay, I've had refreshers from a whole variety of sources. And I think we're lucky to do that. And there's ways you can do it just as a recreationist as well.
And this is one of the things that I think is really cool about backcountry skiing, as opposed to just downhill skiing, which is a ton of fun. But as an athlete, as a skier, you peak in your mid to late 20s, and you can stretch that into your mid 30s. But really, after 40, you're just trying not to get worse every year. But with backcountry skiing, you can continue to improve as long as you can get out and ski tour. So you can be a better ski tour in terms of knowledge and awareness when you're 60 or even 70 than you can when you're younger.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
if there's any questions, let's answer some questions. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. Can you see questions, Sarah?
I see
I
him.
cannot read it.
Ed wants to know if you're streaming from inside a van. Yes.
Who wants to know that?
Edge.
Oh, Edge. Yes, I am.
That's about it. No, we don't really have any questions.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. It's snowing everywhere, so it's not going to be long before you can get out there and enjoy this. So check out those sites at BCA on shoveling technique and look at AAI's refresher page for something in your area, and tune in next week for our final session. Thanks very much for joining us.